Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, and business. This week, Fred Anderson discusses his book, Crucible of War.
Fred Anderson, author of Crucible of War, The 7 Years' War and the Fate of Empire in British North America. We're recording this program at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette building, which is about a 2-minute walk from the Point in Pittsburgh, where the forks of the Ohio. Do you go out there occasionally? And
yeah.
And when you go, what do you think about?
Well, I think about how fortunate it is that it's a park now instead of a railroad, crossing. It was, it's extraordinary actually that the Point's been restored to the point that to the degree that it has and made accessible, because it's one of the most important spots in America.
Why?
Well, just because of the way that it plays such a large part in my book. I mean, what can I say? Of course, it's important. If you just think in geopolitical terms, it was a point that controlled access to the principal communication route in North America into the interior in the 18th century, and once it came under the control of one of the contending empires, there was really no way that the other couldn't fight over it, over control, because in fact it was the spot that in some ways was going to determine the future of the eastern half of North America. So when I do stroll down to the Point and I look at the fountain and I think about that, I try to subtract all the stuff that's around me and imagine what it would be like to be standing on that spot, as Washington did in 1753, thinking about what it meant. And he was quite conscious of in 1753 of the importance of this spot and the degree to which control of it and its deep anchorage, he said, would give people access to a whole future that people were only beginning then to imagine.
For people who are not familiar with what happened at the Point in Pittsburgh at the forks of the Ohio, can you go through the sequence a little bit from the time George Washington stood there and said, there ought to be a fort here?
Right. Well, from 1753, which is that point in history, on, of course, the ball really starts rolling, so we need to back up a little bit. And so it's probably best to go back to sort of the late 1740s, at which point I keep saying point, but the point is, in the late 1740s, there is no permanent white presence in the Ohio country. That's because the Iroquois League, which is the Six Nations of the Iroquois, which are in New York at this point, living in Iroquois, have made it sort of the center point of their policy to keep any European group from establishing a permanent presence in the Ohio country. And that's fine with the French, because what they want is for the English not to be there. And as long as the Iroquois can keep them out, that's great. What the English wish to do, and these are both English colonists in Pennsylvania and in Virginia, what they wish to do is to get access to the interior, because it's incredibly rich farmland. And the English population is very large and growing fast, doubles about every 25 or 26 years in the middle of the 18th century. So once the English colonists breach the Allegheny barrier and begin to settle in the interior, they're going to be just pouring into the heart of an area that New France has been trying to maintain as a zone of Indian alliances that keep them from that will keep the English out. So what's important about 1748 is it's the end of a colonial war, the one that precedes the 7 Years' War. We call it King George's War. In Europe, it was the War of the Austrian Succession. And in the course of that conflict, there's this remarkable event happens, which you'd think is so far away that it couldn't possibly affect the forks of the Ohio, but it does. what happens is that a New England expedition with a Royal Navy support captures Louisbourg, which is a fortress that the French have built on Cape Breton Island, or what was then called Ile Royale.
Where's that?
It's in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So it's up north of what's now Nova Scotia, just off short of the northeast. Louisbourg was a big naval base, and from that you could control everything that went into and came out of the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. So it's the lifeline of New France. When the New Englanders capture that, it's such an incredible event that it's like a miracle. In fact, the New Englanders were convinced that it was evidence of divine intervention. And the upshot is that sort of plugs the St. Lawrence River, in effect, to French trade, which means that the French then cannot get access to the trade goods they need to maintain the Indian alliances and the arms that they need to maintain the Indian alliances in the interior, way out as far as Detroit and even beyond. Now, once that happens, the Indians seek other trading partners. And so there is this remarkable Irish trader, a guy named George Cron. It looks like his name is spelled Krogan, but apparently he said Cron. And Cron comes out from Philadelphia and begins the trade with the Indians, picking up on the demand for arms and trade goods and so forth, and begins to establish trading posts throughout the area. He has one on what's now the site of Cleveland, another one at Logstown, which is about 20 miles downriver from here, and ultimately others as far west as almost the Indiana border, the modern Indiana border, a place called Pickawillany. So what Cron does, in effect, is panic the French by this intrusion into the interior of North America. Now, he's just he's an Irish sort of adventurer in many ways, a really a remarkable figure in all sorts of ways. He learns Indian language as well, and he knows how to deal with native people, and he's sort of a natural-born wheeler-dealer who's also a diplomat and also a trader and also a scoundrel and also a lecher, and he's got all kinds of interesting features in his personality. And there's a good biography of him. If Nicholas Wainwright is still alive, he probably isn't, but if he is, you should interview him. He wrote a book called George Cron, Wilderness Diplomat, which is just great. Wainwright used to teach in Philadelphia. But anyway, check him out. See if he's still with us, because that's a fine book. Anyway, Cron and his associates, these traders, are basically funneling extremely high quality, inexpensive British manufacturers into this area, and that's drawing away all of the Indians from the French alliance. So they're moving, actually, by the time he establishes his trading post at Pickawillany, out in where Piqua, Ohio is today, when he does that, he begins to draw Indians down from Detroit in large numbers. And so the largest Indian settlement that I know of in eastern North America becomes Pickawillany for about a 2-year period. And that's just terrifying to the French, because that's really it's like a magnet pulling away the Indians from the French alliance system that they depend on. So that the appearance of English speculators, land speculators like George Washington, and traders like George Cron in this area is terrifying for them in the late 1740s, and they decide they need to do something to stop that. What they choose to do, they don't have to do this. In fact, the simple solution, the one that would have led to no war at all, would have been for the French to open a highly subsidized trade to make their manufacturers as cheap as English manufacturers were, and just sell them here. That would have kept the English out. It would have satisfied the Indian demand. It would have cemented the alliances probably pretty well in the region. They didn't do that. Instead, they decided to build a series of forts down from Lake Erie to what's now French Creek, or then Rivière au Boeuf, to the Allegheny, to the forks of the Ohio. And the construction of those forts at exactly the same time that the Virginia speculators in the Ohio Company, which the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, is a shareholder in, they're trying to establish a trading post at the forks as well. So these two empires collide out of this colossally complex mix, volatile mix of personal ambition and greed and imperial ambition and policy, right here. And so when Washington is looking at this spot in 1753, to come back to your question, he's looking at it from the perspective of a man who believes that Virginia needs to establish a trading post here in order to establish the connections it needs ultimately to begin settling there. And he knows he's on his way out to these French forts that had been built. There were 3 of the 4 at that point. They'd Venango and upriver of that on French Creek, and then finally on Lake Erie. He doesn't know where he's going to find the French commandant, but ultimately he does find him at Fort Le Boeuf, which is the second of the 3 forts. He's looking for him in order to say, you can't build here. This is ours, and if you try, bad things will happen. And the French commander, who's this remarkable man, Jacques Lagarde de Saint-Pierre, who's an immensely experienced guy. Washington calls him he's like an aged gentleman, with very much the manner of a soldier, I think he says. But Lagarde de Saint-Pierre says, Monsieur, I cannot do that. I am the servant of the king, my master, and I must stay. But I'll send your letter on, right? And so he blows him off, and Washington, he have dinner and all this, and Washington goes back and reports that, the French ain't going. And that's what makes Dinwiddie, Governor Dinwiddie in Virginia, who's also a shareholder in the Ohio Company, so he has a fiduciary interest, you would say, in the success of this colonization venture. That's what makes him decide to press for a fortified trading post using royal cannon to defend the point against the French. So that's what sets up this collision of empires.
Why did Governor Dinwiddie select George Washington for this mission? How old was he?
No, Washington was 21 at that point. So the reason Dinwiddie does it is because Washington's ambitious, because he's a surveyor and a judge of land and can draw maps, and because Washington has a powerful patron in Lord Thomas Fairfax, who was the only nobleman resident in only English nobleman resident in America, and who is proprietor of an area, basically what's called the Northern Neck. The land between the Potomac and the Rappahannock rivers belongs to him, and it extends as far as the head springs of those rivers, which means that it goes all the way up to the Blue Ridge, and even beyond, actually, in the case of the Potomac. That gives him a personal ownership, proprietorship of an area about the size of Massachusetts, or Wales, if you want another analogy. So this guy is hugely important in Virginia politics, and because Washington has been employed by the Fairfax family to survey parts of its claim, and because Washington has gone fox hunting with Lord Thomas, and because he likes the kid, then Washington comes to Dinwiddie with all the right recommendations, all the right credentials, all the right connections. And he desperately wants to see, and Washington himself really wants to see this for several reasons, but one of which is that he's just convinced that the future of the British colonies lies in the interior of North America, and he intends to be, he's so much a creature of the empire himself, he intends to be in on the ground floor of that. So it's a combination, again, of his accessibility, of his connections, and of his ambition that makes him the guy for this mission. But there's one more thing as well, paradoxically. He's young, he's diplomatically inexperienced, and he doesn't speak French. So this would make him, on the face of it, seem to be not a very good candidate for a diplomatic mission. Well, that's because Dinwiddie, who calls Washington his courier, wants the French to believe that he's just a delivery boy, just a messenger boy. In fact, Washington is also a spy, because what he's doing is counting the number of bateaus and canoes that the French prepared. He's looking at the character of their forts and how well they're armed and so forth. I mean, he's there in effect, a reconnaissance mission. So he's a kind of covert operative as well. And his very lack of experience makes him a guy with a good cover.
Now, the English were the first to set up a fort or an establishment of some sort at the point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first fort they built here is a pretty primitive little operation called Fort Prince George, which is named after the Prince of Wales, the man who becomes George III when he's crowned king. And it's small. It's built by about 40 men in about 2 months, I guess. I'm not sure of how long it takes, but it's built in the spring of 1754, and it's really indefensible. And when the French show up with 500 men and cannons and arms, the Virginians who were there building the fort simply say, goodbye. We'll see you later.
You have a scene in your book where they had to decide whether to fight or surrender, and so they decided to surrender, and then the French treated them to a nice dinner.
Of course, yeah. Well, that's one of the things we've lost about the 18th century is the way that people behaved toward each other was in some measure just terribly barbarous and savage, and you would never ever want to live in a situation like that. On the other hand, once you'd worked out a surrender, as in this case, you were no longer enemies or potential enemies, and in that case, you simply got along like gentlemen. And so, later in the war, in 1757, up in New York, at the after the siege of Fort William Henry, which is a brutal siege, it goes on for 6 days, I think. I can't remember the exact. This is the problem with having written the book as long ago as I did, but I can't remember exactly how long it was. But it was a long siege. A lot of people died. Terrible cannonades, and when it's over and they work out the surrender, the Marquis de Montcalm, the French commander-in-chief, invites. No, I take that back. It's actually Colonel Monroe, who is the British commander of the garrison, invites Montcalm to a dinner. And so the officers of the garrison and the officers of the besieging force sit down together, and they have, the best of the wine that's left in the cellar of Fort William Henry and so forth. And that happens on the day before the massacre of Fort William Henry, the one that we remember from the last of the Mohicans. So what's going on there is a sort of an encounter between European soldiers according to the kinds of rules of war that Europeans believed were civilized in the conduct of war. And it's all happening in the context of a war that involves a lot of native allies who not only can't figure out what's going on, but are terribly distressed by the idea that they're not going to get what they came for, which was plunder and prisoners.
Well,
anyway, a long digression.
Something similar happened at Jumonville Glen when Washington was at Fort Necessity taken prisoner and signed a surrender, and then they let him go.
Yes, exactly.
But for people who are not familiar with Jumonville, the situation there, can you just give a thumbnail sketch of what happened?
Yeah, sure. This is you mean the assassination, so-called, of Vincent Jumonville. Well, as I said, Washington comes out in 1753 on this diplomatic mission, and he gets a polite rebuff from the French, and then comes back in 1754 at the head of only about 350 men from Virginia and some others, the independent company of British regulars and a few people from North Carolina and so forth. But he comes back in order to establish that fort. Now, the fort's already been built. Fort Prince George has already been built. And at the time that Washington gets out to within striking distance of it, Fort Prince George has already surrendered. Right. But Washington believes that his mission is to get the French out, and that's what he tries to do. So to do that, he makes friends with, he allies himself with an Indian chief in the region named Tanaghrisson, whom the English call the Half-King. Tanaghrisson is an Iroquois, Seneca chief, and his job is to represent the Iroquois Confederacy's interests in the Ohio country, because the Indians that actually live at the forks of the Ohio are Delawares and Shawnees and Mingos. Mingos are a kind of Western Seneca, all of whom are really interested in escaping the control of the Iroquois League. They're after independence, basically. So when Washington approaches Tanaghrisson is very much it's in very much his interest to acquire an ally that he can use to support his own power, because the power of Indian chiefs is based largely on their ability to provide gifts to their followers. So Tanaghrisson needs who knows at this point that his power is going to be contingent on having an alliance that will provide him with the goods he needs. He's out to make a kind of permanent alliance with Virginia in order to counteract the French, who at this point now control the Forks. If Tanaghrisson ever hopes to go back down there and to regain control of the people, or at least to regain leadership of the people who live in that area, he's going to need someone like Washington and a province like Virginia to supply him with the arms and the alliance that he needs to do it, the goods he needs to do it. So, at this point, of course, the French at the Forks know that there's this Virginia regiment, not as large as a regiment, but that's what it is organizationally, about 300 men up there who look pretty threatening. And they know they have arms, but they don't know what arms they have. They don't know if they have draft animals. They don't know any of the stuff that they need to know. So the French at the Forks dispatch Ensign Jumonville, Louis Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville. They dispatch him with 35 or so men to take a letter to Washington, just like the letter that Washington took the previous year to La Garde de Saint-Pierre. And the letter says, you're trespassing on French property, you must leave, which is exactly what Washington's letter from Dinwiddie had said to La Garde de Saint-Pierre. He's supposed to deliver the letter. At the same time, Jumonville and his men are supposed to find out how many people there are in the English camp, how many animals they have, how many guns how many cannon they're towing. Are they a threat? How well are they supplied? All this stuff. So it's exactly the same thing that was going on the previous year. Well, Tanaghrisson's the first to understand that the French are in the neighborhood, and so persuades Washington that they're a threat, and that they should be dealt with as a threat. So between the two of them, Washington and Tanaghrisson, they attack the camp in sort of a surprise attack around dawn on the 28th of May, 1754. And in the course of that, Jumonville and a dozen or so others of the French troops that are with him, they're Canadians actually that are with him, about a dozen of them, and are wounded. Perhaps one is killed outright. And then there's a lot of confusion, as there is always after firing, and a ceasefire. And then they're trying to work out who's on, what they're there for, what's going on. There's this big language barrier. Washington has a couple of people with him who speak French, but they don't necessarily speak it well. And so while they're trying to sort all this stuff out, as nearly as I can tell, I'm convinced, Tanaghrisson walks up to Jumonville, who's one of the wounded, and says, "You're not yet dead, my father." And then he hits him in the head with a tomahawk. And it says in one source, reached in, washed his hands in the Frenchman's brains, which is a pretty dramatic way to do this, to make a point, which is essentially a diplomatic point, which is simply that if you mess with me, that is to say the half-king, and my friends, the English, this is what you get. And he's trying, in other words, to make an unbreakable alliance between himself and Washington. So it's a horrifying moment. And Washington has no idea, would have had no idea that this was coming. Once it happens, the other Indians, there are about 8 or 10 other Indians, warriors who are with Tanaghrisson, they set about killing and scalping the wounded, so that in the end, Washington is only able to save, or to preserve the life of one of the wounded French, and then to gather the rest of the unwounded ones and sort of hustle them off. And then he tries to figure out exactly what to do next. And what he does is work out a story within which he doesn't quite tell everything that happened. He doesn't, for example, mention until later that it was the Indians that did the killing. He doesn't quite mention how many people were killed in the first fire and whether or not there was anything that happened afterwards.
Did he ever write down what his reaction was to the whole situation?
Yeah, he did. He went back to the camp and he wrote a diary entry, which was quite long and elaborate, which was, as far as I can tell, a dry run for a series of letters he then wrote to other people reporting on the event. which, as I said, was very much sort of passive voice kind of account of what went on there. When the French come back in July, Washington, of course, is encamped at the Great Meadows, which is where Fort Necessity is built. It's a spot that Washington believes is where he's going to concentrate his forces before returning to the forks of the Ohio, and kicking the French out, which is his intent. Well, when they're camped there, the French at the forks decide that they need to take really vigorous measures to remove these people, gather a substantial expedition, which is under the leadership of Jumonville's older brother, and they come back to take it, to kick the English out, take away their, get them out of the Ohio country, take back the fort. When they do that, this is the Battle of Fort Necessity on July 3rd, 1754. They kill about a third of Washington's men. They've got him dead to rights. I mean, they could have taken them all prisoner if they'd wanted to. They don't. Instead, they work out a capitulation by which Washington, when he signs it, takes responsibility for what's called the assassination of Jumonville. Washington, of course, not reading French, doesn't know what he's agreeing to, but nonetheless, he signs it, and his remaining 200 men then can march back to Virginia on the promise that they won't come back. Now, when he does that, and this is kind of a long way around to the answer of your question, when he does that surrender, everything's in chaos. The camp is a shambles. There are lots of wounded men to take care of. There's way more baggage. The animals are mostly dead. They can't haul off all the stuff they've got, the baggage, and so a lot of stuff gets left in the camp. One of the things that's left in the camp is Washington's journal, in which he's described everything, this material to that episode and to his mission to the Ohio and so forth. The French find that, they take it back to France. Ultimately, it finds its way back to France, where it's translated into French and then published to demonstrate, along with the capitulation, to demonstrate that Washington is a cold-blooded murderer who has killed a diplomatic emissary, and therefore that the French have casus belli, that is the right to start a war, should they choose to do so, to declare a war. As it happens, they don't declare war at that point, but this is an intensely embarrassing way for Washington to become an internationally known figure.
He was very famous at a very young
At that point,
age.
he becomes very famous, that's right.
When did it actually become a war?
Well, in Europe, not until 1756, because the French, for a variety of reasons, bide their time until they think they can conduct the war in a way that will benefit them. There are many things that are going on in France at this point, but one of them is that the French are building a navy that they want to be as good as the English, and that's a long, expensive, drawn-out process. Their intention is to have a navy that's at least about 2/3 the size of Britain's before they go to war, and they do intend to go to war eventually. They hope to work out an alliance with Spain before they do that, because the Spanish Navy and the French Navy together would be larger than Britain's and therefore would put the British at a disadvantage. And what the French actually hope to do, interestingly enough, is to conduct a war that would attack the British imperial possessions, not a war in Europe, but a war against the British Empire. Well, for reasons that are probably too complicated to go into, the Spanish alliance doesn't work out, and the French decide that they're in a strong enough position to do this kind of limited war, this limited attack, largely on the basis of naval power, by the spring of 1756. And so then they attack Minorca, which is the English naval base in the Mediterranean. And that's what triggers the war in Europe, what becomes the European War, the 7 Years' War. In the meantime, back in Western Virginia and Western Pennsylvania, there's already a war going on as a consequence of the stuff that begins in 1754, because the British send over 2 regiments under Edward Braddock, to try to remove what they call the French encroachments from English frontiers. At the same time, the French have sent over a whole raft of regular soldiers from France who were supposed to reinforce, the French forts that defend the frontiers. So it's all this complicated stuff.
That was all going on while there was no war?
That's right. That was going on before there was a war in place, formally declared, and blood had been shed in the Americas, and on quite a large scale already at that point, both at the Battle of Fort Necessity, and at Braddock's defeat, when Braddock is marching out in 1755 to try to dislodge the French from the forks of the Ohio. So yeah, there's very much a frontier war going on here, but you see, countries could be fighting each other in the Americas, but still be at peace in Europe, which had been the case really since the 15th century, since the late 15th century. And there's this sort of imaginary line that ran down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean called the Line of Amity, which allowed you to go to conduct a war west of the line, and everything east of it would still remain at peace. So this line of amity, this is what it means to go beyond the line, to cross the line. When you, for what it's worth, you know, when you cross the line, you cross into a war zone. And
did George Washington ever get in trouble for firing on Jumonville? Because I can't put my fingers on it right now, but in your book you have his orders, which say that his mission is to be purely defensive.
Right.
Was that just a ruse that he be purely defensive, or
no?
Did
He thought
ever
he
get
was
yelled at for starting the war.
He thought he was being defensive. He did actually sort of lose face over this. I mean, he was. It wasn't a distinguished way to start your military career, you know, with a big time loss where a third of your command gets killed, and it becomes even more humiliating for him once this diary that the French find and translate is published in Europe, because then at last Washington realizes that what he did was admit to the assassination of Jumonville, and so he feels completely betrayed by all this. That doesn't happen though until after the English, because of the slow communications of the day. All of that is known only after Braddock has crossed the Atlantic with his 2 regiments, and Washington has joined that expedition as an aide-de-camp to Braddock, because one of the things Washington wants to do is become an officer in the British Army, and this is a way to do it. It's not until after that's happened that all that nasty, messy stuff becomes apparent. So Washington is ultimately embarrassed, but he's never fired for what happens. I mean, his job's never really in any sense under threat. Largely because there's once Braddock's defeated, and you know, so many of his men are lost out in what's now Braddock. Once that happens, Virginia needs to have its frontiers defended. The only way they can do that is by raising a new Virginia regiment, and the only person they have to command it is George Washington. So he's really the man of the hour in a way, despite all this, the way he screwed up before.
I want to read what you say about Braddock for a minute here in your chapter, Disaster on the Monongahela. And you talk about, in preparation for Braddock's attack on Fort Duquesne, an Indian, Shingas, came across all the plans for Fort Duquesne and how many soldiers were there, and he presented it to Braddock, a detailed plan of Fort Duquesne. When the Delaware chief stood before him and asked the only question that mattered to the Ohio Indians, what he intended to do with the land if he could drive the French and their Indians away, Braddock answered that the English should inhabit and inherit the land, and he said no savage should inherit the land. Right. So he's like telling his potential Indian ally, well, you're not going to get anything out of being my ally.
That's right. And it doesn't seem like a very diplomatic thing to do, does it?
No, it doesn't. And then you have this Oneida half-king, Scaruaday.
Yeah, you're doing very well. I don't know how these things are pronounced, by the way, so that's I think you did it exactly right.
After Braddock was killed, he told the governor that and the Council of Pennsylvania that Braddock was a bad man when he was alive. He looked upon us, the Indians, as dogs, and would never hear anything what was said to him. We often endeavored to advise him of the danger he was in with his soldiers, but he never appeared pleased with us. So it sounds like he got what was coming.
Well, in a sense, he did get exactly what was coming to him. in another sense, he simply could not understand how powerful Indians were. To him, they were exotics and uncivilized, and he said, it's impossible that they should make an impression on His Majesty's troops. So Braddock had all the positive and the negative features in some ways of 18th century professional officers. I mean, he was on one level a deeply civilized man who believed that war should be left to professionals who can fight it in a civilized way and not involve civilian populations in the bloodshed. At the same time, he was completely unable to understand Indian ways of war and dismissed those as savagery and Indians as therefore savages. So his whole orientation is one in which he's almost, it's almost inevitable that he's going to dismiss the Indians as potential allies, not understand them, and as a result, he dooms himself. So he has, as I said, both the virtues and the flaws of 18th century European professional officers, but he's also sort of tragically doomed at the moment that he says, no savage will inherit the land. He's in effect dooming his expedition because he's no match. None of his men are a match for the Indians.
Well, what was the Indian approach to war? I mean, other than just the tactics of hiding behind trees, I mean, how did they approach the idea of a battle mentally? How did they want to proceed? What did they want to get out of it?
Sure. Well, it's important to realize that, and it's something I should have stressed more strongly in the book, that Indian groups had war aims just like European groups do, right? And Indian warriors had individual motivations just like individual European soldiers had motivations, right? So the war aims of the Indians at the Ohio are essentially to make themselves independent. What they want to do is to play exactly the same kind of diplomatic and political role between the English and the French empires that the Iroquois do, which is a role of neutrality in which the Iroquois are able to balance these powers off against one another and use that system, playing one side off against the other, to their advantage. That's exactly what the Delawares and the Shawnees and the Mingos at the forks of the Ohio want to do on their own, not under Iroquois control. So they're after basically independence, and their policy is to establish their independence. In order to be independent, however, they have to have a functional alliance, and because the French are there, having established Fort Duquesne and the trading post, which is really what's most important about Fort Duquesne, that the French are the only real possible alliance for the Delawares, Shawnees, and the Mingos. Now, that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean they want the French there forever. They would like to see less of a French presence. The best way to make that happen is to cooperate with the French in driving the English out, so that the French, will ultimately withdraw. Furthermore, it's complicated by the fact that there are all these Indians from the Great Lakes region, Ojibwas and Ottawas, Nipissings and others that have come down from the lakes to the forks in order to fight alongside the French. Once those Indians are there, and they're rough customers, then the Delawares, the Shawnees, and the Mingos, the people who actually live at the forks, have much less say in what goes on. So the Indians at the forks have a policy goal of independence. That means cooperating with the French. But when the battles actually occur, when warriors decide to go to war, they're driven by a different set of imperatives, just as modern soldiers are driven by a great many other imperatives than wanting to see American foreign policy executed. They're driven by desires for example, economic security, by patriotism, by a whole complex of personal motives, typically. In the same way, Indian warriors were driven by a complex set of personal motives, part of which was to gain plunder, part of which was to fulfill their culturally defined role as men, which was to be warriors, and part of which was to take prisoners who could then be adopted into their own people's villages to replace the people who had died, the so-called mourning war tradition. They had all these motives, these complex motives, which would drive them in battle. Once they began to attack, they fought. The Indian culture typically was to fight as individuals, without a lot of coordination. Although they did, in fact, in the case of Braddock, adopt an envelopment kind of strategy or tactic, where the Indians sort of dispersed in the woods on both sides of this column that was trapped in the road. So they were coordinated at that point, but basically what happened in the battle itself was largely individual and determined by individual warriors' motivations. So when the battle's over, and you have the stripping of corpses and the plundering and the taking of scalps and the taking of prisoners and all that sort of stuff, those actions which the British think of as savage are actually the playing out of the role of warrior as understood by the people who just won this great victory. They don't then follow the retreating English back and try to kill them off. That's to do so wouldn't serve any particular point. They've driven out the enemy. They've got the plunder. They've got the scalps. They've got captives that they want. So, all in all, the answer to your question is, it's complicated.
There's so much to talk about this war and about this book, and we've only got an hour. But I want to ask you a little bit about yourself.
How are we doing?
If I could. You are a teacher?
Yes, I am.
Where do you teach?
I teach at the University of Colorado at Boulder.
What do you teach?
I teach early American history. Principally, I'm interested in the 18th century, the Revolutionary era, and the early national period. So those are the upper level courses I teach. But I teach survey courses that cover pretty much the gamut of American history.
In the whole scope of world history, what attracts you about early American history?
It's where I did my PhD thesis, and therefore, obviously of transcendent importance. I mean, what could be more important?
What was your thesis?
It was actually it was on the 7 Years' War in Massachusetts. It became a book called The People's Army: Massachusetts Soldiers and Society in the 7 Years' War, and it was basically about the social experience of war among young New England men, how they experienced it, what the war meant to them, and what its possible connections to the Revolution might have been. I set out to write a book about the Revolution, but I got sort of stuck in this preliminary period when I was trying to explain the context. And it turned out to be so fascinating that I then wrote a second book, which became Crucible of War, trying to tell a larger story, still trying to get to the Revolution. But as you know, I only got to 1767 with that, or 66. And so finally, the next book, the one I've just finished with a good friend of mine and my collaborator, Andrew Caton, a book called The Dominion of War, tries to cover all of American history from 1500 to 2000, and to look at the place of war and empire in that larger scheme. What's happened as a result is that Drew, Caton, and I have sort of resituated the American Revolution as a two-phase event, which begins with this war for empire and its success, which creates as a kind of a completely unanticipatable consequence the Revolutionary War that shatters the British Empire and establishes the United States. By resituating the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and the Revolution together in that way in the narrative, we found it casts all of American history in a very different light. And so the sort of the end point of this long process of trying to figure out what the heck the 7 Years' War means has led us to a kind of reformulation of the whole American historical narrative. And the book I'm just now finishing, which is a companion volume or a little illustrated guide to the events of the 7 Years' War, that will accompany a TV series that'll air on PBS in probably in January of 2006, called The War That Made America. So, and that I think will be my last word on the 7 Years' War. I've said everything I possibly can about it, and I find something else to do.
Books could be written to answer this question, but can you give a brief explanation about how the French and Indian War led to the Revolutionary War? And first of all,
Sure.
were the colonists taxed at all before the French and Indian War?
Oh, they paid a lot of taxes, but they were taxed. They taxed themselves for the administrative costs of government, and they were taxed indirectly by the British through trade, the customs on transatlantic trade. But those never raised any revenues. Those customs taxes never raised revenues. They never even covered the cost of the collection. And so they were regarded as simply the way that the British Empire structured trade within the empire, made certain commodities in effect captive of the transatlantic trade to Britain and so forth. So it's a mercantilist kind of taxation that really wasn't a direct burden on the colonists. So yeah, the colonists were used to paying taxes. They just thought that they had the right to consent to them. The British never granted that was a right. So that was the ultimate problem. However, the reason it became a problem is the 7 Years' War, which is enormously expensive, especially given the way William Pitt, who is in effect the Prime Minister of England, wins it. Pitt basically makes allies of the English colonists in North America instead of trying to direct them as the earlier commanders had, like Earl of Loudon and Braddock, instead of trying to just essentially make the colonists do their will because they're the British and the colonists are the colonists. What Pitt does is invite the colonists to participate, offers to reimburse them for a proportion of their expenses or expenses in proportion to their participation in the war, and opens up the possibility for these Americans to imagine that they are really what they want to be, which is partners in an empire, kind of co-conquerors of the French. Well, when the war ends, the British have doubled their national debt, and they're in possession of half a continent that they have to administer. So they have these huge problems of control and huge problems of finance that grow out of the 7 Years' War. And it's in response to trying to solve those problems, to make some sense out of this new empire and to make it functional, and to get the colonists, who've never been good at cooperating with each other or with the crown, to get the colonists to sort of march to the same drummer. Those are the imperatives that grow out of the war that make the British want to tax the American colonists. So the connection between, to answer your question, the connection between the 7 Years' War and the Revolution is an indirect one, but a powerful one, because the war creates expectations on the part of the colonists that they're partners. It creates problems for the British to solve that they believe they can only solve by the exertion of sovereign power. And it creates a set of presumptions on the part of the British that suggest that ultimately, if the colonists don't cooperate, they can be forced to cooperate, because Britain is the closest thing at the end of the war that the 18th century had to a superpower. And there was no way that a bunch of raggedy colonists could possibly stand up to the most powerful army and the most powerful navy and the most efficient army in the world, which had, after all, just gotten done conquering two great European empires. How could an American insurrection amount to a hill of beans?
Impossible.
Yeah. So so my view is that you can't actually understand what goes on, at least in the period prior to 1776. You really can't understand that as a coming revolution so much as a quarrel among people who are equally committed on both sides of the Atlantic to the empire, but just can't agree on what that empire means.
There's so much I want to ask about, and we're going to run out of time, but I want to, so forgive me if I jump around in the last few minutes. But you talk about going back to the forts that were established by the French and also by the English, Fort Le Boeuf and Presque Isle and Fort
Machault. Venango or Machault.
Venango, and Fort Ligonier a little bit later. You say,
well, Ligonier is a British fort.
Right.
Yeah.
But established by both. You say, in principle, they comprised a chain of forts linked by several frequent patrols of soldiers scouting for enemies. In reality, they were so undermanned that patrols seldom ventured far from their walls. They were 18 to 20 miles apart, making them better targets for French and Indian war parties than barriers against raiders. Can you describe a little? Okay,
I'm going to have to. I'm sorry, but you're conflating two different sets of forts.
Well, my question essentially is, what would life have been like at one of those forts? And did you spend days and weeks just sitting completely isolated from anybody else? And what kind of messages would you have heard? What function did they serve other than just to kind of sit there?
Well, first, let me just sort out different kinds of fort issue. The French forts, Michel, Leboeuf, Duquesne, those are forts where trade with the Indians is the principal activity. I mean, there's
a lot of active in and out.
Yeah, there's constantly coming and going. And it's like having a great big Walmart there. For want of a better analogy. I mean, you know what happens when Walmart moves in, right? I mean, it just sucks in all the trade from the surrounding areas. That was the purpose of the forts, and so the French forts were really quite modest in size, and they were intended to be kind of welcoming to the Indians. They didn't, in any sense, try to exert direct power over the surroundings so much as to create a desirable place for interaction.
The goal was mainly to make money for France?
No, the goal was that would have been fine if they could have done it. In fact, they lost money on it. But what they were doing was making alliances. They were making friends for France among the Indian people on whom the French, control of the interior had to rely. So that's that. Now, the forts you were describing when you read that passage were the ones that Virginia established on the frontier in the Shenandoah Valley after the war actually begins. And those are as often as not individual houses, stone houses for the most part, that have fortifications or stockades set up around them, which are manned by tiny numbers of people. And they're, in effect, refuges for the few farmers that remain in the neighborhood who haven't fled. And so whenever the Indians attack or appear in the neighborhoods, they're places that you can flee for refuge. Now they're manned by tiny handful of militia or Virginia Regiment troops, mostly militia groups, and life in those, especially when they're under attack, is unbelievably nasty. Because the people will drag in they bring their families, they bring in as many livestock as they can to keep them from being killed and so forth, and then they huddle within the stockade in these tiny cramped houses, which are really no more than just 3 or 6 or rooms perhaps with a well, where they can get water. They huddle there until it's safe to go out again. So they're terrible places. They're more targets than they are really defensive areas, and because they're so far apart, because they're about 20 miles apart, it's impossible to do the rational thing, which is to secure the areas in between by patrolling back and forth. If they were a couple of miles apart, you could do that, but there's no way that you can take a 350-mile long frontier, which is how long the Shenandoah is, and turn that into a real secure region by really constructing a true chain of forts. Does that get the?
I think it does.
Okay.
Yeah. When Braddock was defeated, you say in your book that the frontier was essentially rolled back to Carlisle.
Essentially, that's right. Yeah.
Were there many English settlers west of that area?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Nobody knows exactly how many. Thousands. And a variety of sanctioned and unsanctioned settlements. I mean, some of them were places like Gnadenhutten that were, formally established, had title to the land, were, real communities.
Where was that? Because you refer to a massacre of a Moravian pacifist community
at Gnadenhutten. It's on the. I can't remember which side of the drainage it's on. It's north of Philadelphia, maybe 60 miles or so north of Philadelphia or so, in either the east Susquehanna drainage or in the Delaware River drainage.
Toward the Lehigh Valley.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's yeah.
Okay. You also. Toward the end of your book, after the treaty...
The problem with this is there's somebody who's watching this now, who has an intensely comprehensive grasp of Pennsylvania geography, and I apologize to you, sir or madam, for having gotten the location of Gnadenhutten wrong.
And in fairness,
please forgive me for it.
You're from Colorado, and you wrote this book this book was published in 2000, and we are recording this in 2005, so some time has elapsed.
Some has, yes.
But your book,
thank you.
Your book ends. The treaty that ends the French and Indian War is about 3/4 of the way through the book, and toward the end of the book, you talk about two things that One is a war between Pennsylvania and Connecticut, and the other is Pontiac's War. First of all, can you talk briefly about the war between Pennsylvania and Connecticut?
The so-called Pennamite War. And it's not a real full-blown war between, Connecticut doesn't march troops against Pennsylvania and vice versa. But what's happened is there's an area called the Wyoming Valley that figures prominently in this. It's a stretch of Susquehanna, east branch of the Susquehanna, between what's then Shamokin and where the river curves back north and west. It's what's there? Wilkes-Barre is there. Okay. That is a very valuable land, very rich farmland, and because it's right in line with the western border of Connecticut, and Connecticut has a sea-to-sea charter, people in Connecticut believe that they have the right to settle that land and to grant it on the basis of this old charter. So in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, there are a lot of Connecticut Yankees who are trying to settle in that land. Now, it's also, obviously, within the Penn family's patent in Pennsylvania. So you've got this conflicting jurisdictions over who should grant the land. Now, how do you establish real ownership of the land? Well, possession, they say, is 9 points of the law, right? So if you can actually move in and claim the land by physically occupying it, that's the best way to do it. So the Yankees are trying to move in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. The Pennsylvanians are waking up to the fact that their land is being, in the Wyoming Valley, Penn land as they see it, is being occupied by these Yankees who are not paying quit rents, who are not who are not taking the title properly as they should from the Penns and so forth. At the same time that this land had been promised by the government of Pennsylvania to Indians as a kind of reserve during the 7 Years' War, and it's occupied by a whole lot of eastern Delawares who are living in this area. So when the Yankees move in, there's a lot of dispute between them and the Indians over whether or not they have any right to be there. The Yankees intended to take possession of the place by force, and all that happens as sort of backdrop to, and then there's bloodshed, I should say. But all that happens as a kind of a backdraft of Pontiac's War, which breaks out in 1763 in Detroit, which is a huge Indian uprising against British claims of control. This dispute over the Wyoming Valley, or the East Branch of the Susquehanna, is part of a friction between colonies based on the desire to occupy valuable land and to take it away from Indians. Pontiac's War represents a response to these post-war conditions within which Indians are trying to teach the English a lesson about how allies properly behave, because the Indians, of course, have abandoned the French alliance. That's the reason the French lose the 7 Years' War more than anything else. Once that's happened, and they've shifted their allegiance to their alliance to the British, they expect to be treated with respect. They expect to be treated with restraint. And what the British try to do in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War is reform the Indians, just as they try to reform their colonies. They do it by suspending the trade in liquor, by suspending the giving of diplomatic gifts, by restricting the amount of gunpowder that the Indians can have access to. And that's what makes the Indians explode in this insurrection, to teach them a lesson. All that, then, is this sort of terrible, sort of violent aftermath of the 7 Years' War. And the reason this book goes on so long beyond the end of the war is because I was trying to show that even though the war is over, its effects linger and structure the way that people react to the empire, the British Empire and its initiatives after the war. That dispute between the Connecticut Yankees and the Pennsylvania settlers, the Pennamites as they're called, goes on through the 1760s into the 1770s, once the Indians are gone from the Ohio country, or once the Indians are gone from the Wyoming Valley. So there's a terrible set of animosities that grow out of that.
I wish we could keep talking, but we're out of time, and we have barely scratched the surface of the French and Indian War as told in this book, Crucible of War. Fred Anderson, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books. a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.